Greetings, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my series about the Northern Ireland Troubles. So I left off in 1970 with the formation of the SDLP, John Hume, Dr. Joe Hendren, amongst the leading lights in the foundation of that party. They initially thought they might be able to support the UDR. The idea was the UDR would be 35% Catholic. It was 20% Catholic at most in the early days. That soon dropped to 3%, and the SDLP felt obliged to withdraw support. They felt it was not cross-community enough, and that had been infiltrated by loyalist terrorists. Decades later, secret UK government documents said that it was estimated anything from 5 to 15% of the UDR were involved with loyalist terrorists. Anyway, so this is when the conflict really began to kick off. In 1970, a few gun battles between the IRA and the British Army. Then in 1971, Gunner Richard Curtis was shot dead by the IRA. He was the first soldier to be killed in Ireland, British soldier, since 1924. Anyway, because some IRA men had killed some British soldiers going ashore at Haulbowline Island in 1924. That's in County Cork. After the conflict was over, because the British military was allowed to retain 3 bases in the south of Ireland to 1938. That's by the by. By an astonishing coincidence, the man who killed Curtis was shot dead himself a few weeks later on Curtis Street. So some people who were superstitious felt that there was something to that. Things really got more vicious in March 1971, when 3 young soldiers were invited to a party. They were assured there would be women and drink available, and they went and they're all shot dead by the roadside. They'd been duped. So these 3 teenagers from a Scottish regiment caused outrage when they were killed, because they'd been killed by such underhand means. 2 of them were brothers, incidentally. So this was to be the IRA's standard modus operandi, targeting unarmed people as much as possible. Anyway, let me see. So some nationalists felt moved by these deaths as well. Anyway, Sir James Chichester Clark, he flew to London in April 1971. He appealed to the Prime Minister of the UK, Edward Heath, for more troops, and he said if more soldiers not forthcoming, he was going to resign. An additional 1,300 men. Heath refused to dispatch extra soldiers, so Chichester Clark honoured his pledge and he resigned. He was a man of his word. He was ennobled as Lord Moyola. So the Ulster Unionist Party had to select a new leader. They elected Brian Faulkner. Faulkner came from a family that owned a shirt company in County Down. He'd been to St Columba's School in Dublin. He even spoke a tiny bit of Irish. So he wasn't from the upper class like some previous Unionist leaders had been. He spoke with a mild Northern Irish accent. Another point about Faulkner, well, he was a Protestant, not surprisingly, as all Ulster Unionist Party leaders were, is he hadn't been in the armed forces in the Second World War. He'd been managing a shirt factory. He said that was service too. He'd opposed some of the more limited reforms proposed by O'Neill a few years earlier. He now found himself in the invidious position of having to implement more extensive reforms than the ones that he had set his face against. He also said some changes have been made which cannot now be reversed, even though he'd opposed them earlier on. So there was going to be a vote for all adults in local elections. Incidentally, the age of legal majority throughout the UK had been reduced from 21 to 18 in 1970, largely to try and help the Labour government win the election, because they're more popular amongst the youth. The B specials had gone. Efforts to eliminate discrimination in the allocation of local housing and in employment and so forth. Right, so why did Unionists so oppose joining the Republic of Ireland? Well, the Irish Republic were not as rich as the United Kingdom. We didn't have the NHS or free university education. Our roads weren't as good. Partly it's just national identity. The Unionists regard themselves as British. They want to be united with Wales, Scotland and England. They opposed the confessional state in the Republic of Ireland. The Irish Republic, according to our 1937 constitution, it said that Ireland's a Christian nation and the Catholic Church has a special place because that is the denomination of the vast majority of citizens of the state. The army and the guards, that's the police, would parade at Corpus Christi every June. But there were liberals in the South who said that the Irish Republic should become a secular state. Mary Robinson, prominent barrister, was one of them. She was a professor of law at Trinity College Dublin, aged 24. So in 1971 there was a referendum which deleted that article of the Constitution which recognised the privileged position of the Catholic Church, and the Irish Republic became secular. Northern Ireland had been secular since 1870, since the Church of Ireland had been disestablished. It's true in England, even to this day, the Church of England is the established church, but that is for England only, not the whole United Kingdom. Paisley said he would regard the Irish Republic in a different light if we were to become a secular country. Well, we did become a secular country, but I don't think that changed his attitude one iota. Anyway, there was a rising tide of violence. The IRA were attacking the RUC and killing them, the British Army, and the security forces were fighting back. Loyalist terrorists were killing Catholic civilians, and the IRA was trying to kill the Loyalist terrorists. Difficult to identify since they usually didn't wear uniform. They had no obvious bases. So in August 1971, it was decided that internment must be introduced to get the violence down. This had been done successfully in the First World War, in the 20s, in the 40s, in the 50s. The Republic of Ireland had introduced it even before we were a republic. We'd done so in the Civil War and in the Second World War and in the 1950s. It had previously been introduced across the whole of Ireland simultaneously, but this time relations between Dublin and Belfast were so bad that the Republic of Ireland was not going to play ball. So there were Republicans to be locked away, but it was discussed in the cabinet of Northern Ireland, how about Loyalist terrorists, locking them up too, because otherwise it will appear to be unfair. As one minister pointed out, we mustn't lock people up simply for the sake of appearances. The RUC had very little intelligence on the Loyalist terrorist organisations because they're quite new. Moreover, the UVF and the UFF were not very organised. They didn't need to be. It was a fairly simple task to drive to a Catholic majority area and just shoot any man. That didn't need a great deal of planning. Whereas the IRA's attacks on the security forces required rather more reconnaissance, planning and so forth. So the RUC knew rather little about the Loyalist terrorist organisations. Anyway, one Sunday in August, about 4 a.m, snatch squads went in and they arrested lots of IRA suspects. The RUC's files were very out of date. Sometimes they arrested men who were elderly, hadn't been active for decades, or father and son had the same name, and the RUC would accidentally arrest the wrong one of them. Sometimes the information was very sketchy, just a physical description and address, so they might arrest the wrong man who's at the address. Some of the IRA had anticipated this was going to happen and had indeed gone into hiding before the 4th of August. So about 500 suspects were brought in the dragnet. About half of them were released within 2 days. So a handful of them were subjected to the 5 techniques, as in hooding, stress positions, white noise. Some were kicked and punched, and so on. The IRA recall this with their song, "The Men Behind the Wire." Armoured cars and tanks and guns came to take away our sons. We must all stand behind the men behind the wire. So anyway, 4 men later took their case to the European Court of Human Rights. The Irish government actually sued the UK. It was initially found that the UK had tortured these 4 men. That was overturned in appeal, but it was found to be inhuman and degrading treatment. That's that. Some men were put into helicopters, blindfolded, brought way up high, the blindfold taken off. We're going to push you out of the helicopter. And then the helicopter's brought down to a metre off the ground. The man had been hooded again, and then he's pushed out, believing he's going to die. I met a guy who was a British Army interrogator who told me that they did that. Another thing about the RUC and Army interrogators is all of them were Catholics. That was a rule. And the man who told me about this said it was so there was absolutely no way Republicans could claim these are orange bully boys. No, only Catholics could be doing it. Anyway, eventually some Loyalist terrorist suspects were interned too. They were all sent to Long Kesh, which is a former RAF base. People locked up in huts there, an IRA section, a Loyalist section. The prisoners were allowed to run their own affairs. Now, were they really members of the IRA and Loyalist terrorist outfits? Well, they certainly behaved like they were. They had an officer commanding, they paraded, they wore uniforms, they carried flags. So some of this has been filmed actually by the UVF. So all this could have been used to prosecute them because they were there on suspicion. They hadn't actually been charged with any crime. Habeas corpus had been suspended because the security situation had deteriorated so disastrously. So that was that. Not that many key IRA players were lifted. As an attempt to reduce the level of violence, it backfired spectacularly. So it was carried out in a cack-handed manner, and it alienated the Catholic community even more so than before.